we are going over techniques, pastel techniques. The supplies that I'm going to be using today are my soft pastels and my oil pastels. So whichever set of pastels you have is good. You can still follow along and try them out. There are a lot of techniques that you can use with both of these pastels. And then there are a few techniques that are very specific to oil pastels and a few techniques that are very specific to soft pastels. So go ahead and grab your pastels. We'll kind of go through some of these techniques, and you're welcome to follow along with me as well. And I have to say, I think when it comes to learning a new technique or a new supply, a new medium, that the best way to learn is by getting in there and trying it out. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to try out some of these different techniques. So grab your pastels, whichever one you have, or if you have both, pull them out. And I'm going to be using some watercolor paper today. So you can use, there's paper that's specific to pastels, a pastel paper. You can definitely use that. You can use mixed media paper. You can use watercolor paper like I am. All those types of papers work well. And just as a reminder, the best type of paper to use for pastels are going to be the rougher surface. So you can use like sketch paper or copy paper, that'll work. But the best paper, the one you get the best results from, are going to be those papers with the tooth, with those rough textures. If you have just the oil pastels, that's perfect. If you have just the soft pastels, that's perfect. And if you have both, that's also perfect. So know that whatever you have will work for today. So I'm going to start off, I have my paper set up here. And I'm just going to start off, and I'm going to use a marker just so it's easier to see on camera. But I'm going to start off just by writing up here, oil and soft. I'm going to do examples of the techniques with both of the types of pastels. So whichever pastel you have, you can follow along with and kind of see the difference as well. And again, just as a reminder, it's really not important to know each name of these techniques or each of these techniques specifically. What's important is knowing that you can use these materials in a variety of ways. And so the best way to kind of learn that, figure that out, is by trying it out. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. If you were in our watercolor series, some of these techniques may sound familiar. That's a good sign, I guess. But anyway, we're going to start off with our first technique. It's called flat painting. Flat painting is just covering a surface. So whether you're using oil pastels or soft pastels, it's really just filling in a space or filling in a line. And so for oil pastel, I'm going to start, and I'm going to be using some blue. So with my oil pastel, I'm just going to kind of fill in a square space. So if you have your pastel, go ahead and do that. It's just kind of like coloring it in, filling in that space. And as you're doing that, I want you to notice just kind of how much pressure it takes to fill in that square, right? How much pressure it takes to kind of fill in each of those spaces. And notice also that when you have that textured paper, there's a lot of white that shows through, that paper shows through. So just kind of notice how much pressure it takes to kind of fill that in and get all that color to the surface. So if you have oil pastels, go ahead and try that out. And I want to encourage the same with the soft pastels. So I'm going to take my soft pastel and do the same. So if you have soft pastels, go ahead and fill in that square too. Notice, again, how much pressure it takes to fill in those spaces, right? To cover in those squares, fill in that white. One of the things that you'll notice if you're using soft pastel, or even if you're just watching what I'm using, you'll notice that the oil pastels were much cleaner, right? There's not a lot of debris, I guess, from using the oil pastel, but you can see that chalk pastel, there's a lot of that soft pastel, there's a lot of dust, pastel dust that shows up. And so soft pastels, just as a reminder from last time, the soft pastels, they blend so much nicer, and we'll see that in just a moment, but they can be a little messier. So that's just kind of one thing to keep in mind as we're going through this process today. So this is flat painting. And this is covering in a surface, coloring in a space. And you can see it took a while with each of them to really color that space in and color that white. So our next one that we're going to do is called smudging, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's smudging the surface, kind of blending your surface with your finger, with a blending stick, or stomp with a tortilla, with a Q-tip, but it's kind of using that to blend that surface in. And so I'm going to take with my oil pastel here, and I'm just going to make a mark, a little square. And I'm going to do the same with my soft pastel, just kind of make a little square. Right. So for blending, I'm going to start off. I've got a couple supplies here. I have my tortilla, and I have a Q-tip, and of course I have my finger. And so if you have any of these supplies, which of course we all have fingers, so you can try it out that way, just take your finger and try to blend that oil pastel. Feel how it blends. And then come over, if you have your soft pastel, do the same. Feel the way it blends. It smudges, right? I like using my fingers because I feel like I have more control when I'm doing the smudging. But the thing to be aware of is that our skin, our body has oils in it, so it can affect our blending, our smudging. And so sometimes it's nice to have that tortilla or that blending stump, which is just wrapped paper, and you can use that to blend. So if you have any of these supplies, just kind of try it out and feel how it's blending. Noticing the difference between like using your finger or using a Q-tip, for example, using that tortilla. And see how it blends. I will say oil pastels in general are not going to blend as smoothly or as easily as soft pastels. That's kind of not necessarily a bad thing, but it's one thing to be aware of when we're using our pastels, right? So this one is called smudging, right? And it, like I said, is exactly what it sounds like. You're smudging the material, blending it with your finger, with a blending stump, a tortilla, or Q-tip, or any other supply that uses blending. Now, the next technique is called layering. And it's where we're stacking colors on top of colors, right? And so I'm going to start off with my oil pastel, and I'm just going to kind of color in a space. Do a flat painting like I did in the first one, just kind of color in that space. So if you have your oil pastel, go ahead and try that out. And what I'm going to do is take another color, and I'm going to do a darker blue, but it doesn't matter what other color you're doing. And I'm just going to draw on top of it. I'm going to draw just a little leaf. Right? So I'm coloring it in quite a bit as well. So this is layering, right? One of the fun things about layering is that, you know, I just use my my oil pastel to draw on top of it, but you can use a spatula or a palette knife. And what you can do is just kind of scrape off a little bit of that pastel, right? And this only works with oil pastels. But I can scrape a little bit of that oil pastel off on my palette knife and use that to layer. And you can see it does just a really nice texture as well. So if you do have access to a palette knife, a butter knife also works. But if you have access to a palette knife or scraper, you can try that out and see how the layering happens there. Now, this is not something that you can do with soft pastel as easily, but it's something that's really nice with the oil pastels. It gives you a different look, right? Now, when it comes to the soft pastels, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to take my soft pastel and color in a flat painting space, right? Fill in that space. And then take another pastel. I'm going to use a red and draw on top of it, layer on top of it. You can see the difference, right? hopefully you can see the difference with mine. And if you have yours, you can kind of feel, if you have both of them, you can feel the difference between using that oil pastel, that smoother application, and that rougher application of the soft pastel. And see the difference in how it layers as well, right? And a lot of that, again, has to do with the way it's made, its makeup. That oil pastel is oil based, right? So it's going to be smoother for sure. So you can kind of see the difference there. Now this is layering. So those are our first three techniques. Okay. Flat painting, which is filling in a space or a line. Smudging, which involves kind of rubbing, smudging the material. You can use your finger, tortillon, or a blending stump, a Q-tip, and you can see the difference in how it blends. And again, you notice that oil pastels just don't kind of blend the way soft pastels do. And then layering. Layering is where you're putting a layer of pastel on top of another layer. And so you can see how that works here. This is a flat painting where we put a leaf on top, and then I also showed how to do with a palette knife, and then the same with that soft pastel. The next one I want to talk about is overlay. And this overlaying is very similar to glazing with watercolor. And so it's kind of layering a different color on top of another color, very similar to layering, but you're seeing those other colors come through. So for example, I'm going to take my soft pastel here and just kind of fill in the space. I'm not doing as filled in a color, right? A shape. You can still see some of the white showing through, but I can take like another, like a yellow, and do the same thing, right? And you can see that color blends, right? That color shows through. I can even do it with like a red. Right. And so you can see that overlay in color kind of comes through there. And that's with oil pastel. With chalk or soft pastel, it's kind of the same thing. I'm going to start with my color, my background color. Right? And then if I want to add, I'll do a yellow for this one. You can see the same thing, right? The yellow and even the red. Right? And see how that color kind of comes through. We're layering it on top of itself, right? And so it's not just kind of filling in, like layering on top where you have these solid colors, of these solid colors on top of solid colors, but it's letting those colors blend a little bit, right? And so that's called overlaying. That's where you're seeing those colors kind of come through. Now, the next one I want to talk about is actually called blending. And this is where you're using multiple colors on top of other colors, right? But you're blending and painting and blending and like blending, painting, blending, painting. So what that looks like, I'll get my oil pastel first. I'm going to do blue, right? And just kind of fill in some of my blue here. And then I'm going to do some yellow. And so blending is actually where you're doing that kind of overlap, right? So I'm doing the yellow, the blue, kind of smudging it and blending it to get that new color, right? And so that's a way to kind of blend those colors together and get a new look from it, right? So it's kind of going back and forth between adding color and smudging and adding color and smudging. And so that's um, a way to get your new color, right? So with the soft pastel, it's kind of the same thing, right? So I'm going to use my blue and I'm going to use my yellow, right? And then just kind of blend it, doing some smudging, some coloring, smudging. And I'm using just my finger for it, but you can use that tortillon, you can use the blending stump. Any one of those will work as well. And you can kind of see, I'm going to dump the dust off really quickly. Okay. But you can kind of see the difference in how they're blending, right? Sometimes the oil pastels don't blend as well as the soft pastels do. That's okay. It's just a different material. It doesn't mean that oil pastels are bad or that soft pastels are good. It just means they kind of come together in different ways, right? And so you can use this technique with both of them to get this kind of smooth blending like color. Okay? And so this is what's called blending. Blending. Okay. Now our next technique is very similar to blending, but it's called gradient. And so what this one is kind of a natural transition into another color. So let's say I've got, I'm gonna do green to start off with. So for my oil pastel, I'm gonna start with some green. Right? And then let it transition into yellow, right? We want that natural transition, right? So it looks like a smooth transition, right? So that means kind of coloring it in. And seeing that kind of blend smoothly, right? With blending, it's really just laying that color down and using your finger or your tortillon to kind of mix those colors together. With gradient, it's that natural transition from one color to another. There's no, this is the blue, where the blue ends, and this is where green starts, this is where green ends, and this is where yellow starts, but it's that smooth transition, right? And so that's what using with oil pastel. With soft pastel, it'll look very similar. So the soft pastel, I'm going to start with the green again, and then come in with my yellow. And we want that kind of smooth transition going from one color into the other. It's a little easier to do with the soft pastel because it does blend so much easier, smoother. And so you can see that natural gradient, right? And so that's what this technique is. So just as a little recap, overlay is similar to layering because you're putting one color on top of another color, right? The difference is that with this one, you're seeing color come through. So it's not that solid application of pigment. It's kind of that gentle application, and you can see those layerings happen, right? Now, blending is where you're taking two or more colors and you are applying pigment, painting, and then using your finger or tortilla to smudge it, add more pigment, smudge it, add more pigment, smudge it, until you get that new color, right? In blending, you see very clearly where one color ends and the next color begins. With gradient, it's that natural smooth transition from one color into another, right? So you have with these, both of these here, we start with the green, but we have that smooth transition into that other color, into that yellow. You don't really see where the green ends and where the yellow starts, right? And so that's kind of the big difference between those as well. So these next few techniques are can be kind of fun and are really helpful when we're actually doing a paint, like a pastel painting, whether it's like a landscape or a portrait or still life. These next few techniques can be a lot of fun to work with. And the first one I want to mention is stippling. So stippling is kind of like just dots. If anyone has ever seen Sunday Afternoon on La Grande Jatte, that big painting at the Art Institute was done all in dots, pointillism. And that's what stippling is. It's that all those dots. And so for an oil pastel, what that looks like is just kind of pressing into that surface, right? So I'm adding those dots. They're not in any special order. I can make them more concentrated in a space and less concentrated in another. right? It's a way to add some shading, some shadow, some depth, but it's just adding those dots. So it's kind of tapping that surface. I can also add another color to it. It doesn't have to be just the one color. You can see I'm just kind of pressing, tapping into that surface. And when it comes to the soft pastels, it looks very similar, right? So I've got my soft pastel and I'm just putting those dots on that surface, right? Again, the same thing. I can make it really concentrated with those dots or kind of spread out. But it's literally just kind of tapping your pastel on the paper, doing those dots. And of course, you can add different colors as well. It doesn't have to be that one color. Make it more concentrated in an area or less concentrated. Okay. And this is called stippling. The next thing is very similar to stippling. It's called scumbling. And this is a technique that we talk about in watercolor as well. But it's kind of shading, adding shading like we do with the stippling, but it's with marks instead of dots, right? And so what that looks like with the oil pastels is more like this kind of mark. It's like little scratches, right? Short little marks. This is really helpful when you're doing something like water or grass, leaves. It's a way to add texture and shading. And again, you can add other colors. It doesn't have to be just one, which is what makes it perfect for something like grass and leaves, right? Adding that kind of depth. And you can do that the same with soft pastels. It's making those kind of scratchy marks. And they're not all going the same direction, right? We're going in different directions. It's kind of this abstract look. Some are different lengths, right? So I'm just going to use a lighter color here so you can blend it in, right? Doing those different marks. And you can see it's different, right? It's different from the stippling. It covers more space. I will say a lot of times when I use, if I'm doing landscape, right? A lot of times I will kind of combine these two because they just like work well for creating that depth, for creating shading, for creating texture, right? And this one is scumbling. Mm. And so these are really great ones to use. Um, the next one I want to talk about that works for both oil and soft pastels is frottage, which is like a like a funny word. But what it means is creating texture by lightly rubbing the side of the pastel on rough paper, right? And so what that looks like, I have my oil pastel here. It kind of peeled off some of that paper. And so to use it with the oil pastel, it's just gently rubbing, right? It's not applying a whole lot of pressure, but it's giving this kind of textured background, right? With the soft pastel, it kind of looks a little nicer, I think. But again, it's like just lightly pressing. And if you have that textured paper, watercolor paper, like I have today, you can really see that texture from the paper that's showing up, right? So you can see the difference between the oil pastel and the soft pastel. But it's using the side of the pastel and lightly rubbing it on the paper to create that kind of textured look. Okay. And so this one is called frottage, Frottage. And so that's kind of the difference. These are really great. One, when you're covering a large space, using the side of your pastel is helpful. You can create kind of this light textured background. And then again, the stippling and scumbling, they're perfect for things like grass and leaves and bushes and trees and bark, creating that depth and creating texture and helping create kind of shadow and adding some of that darkness and color. So the stippling is just dots. Scumbling is the mark making, but it's basically doing the same thing. And then frottage is really just using the side of the pastel to lightly press into the paper and create a colored background. Those are the different techniques that work well for both the soft pastel and the oil pastel. So what I want to do now is talk about a couple techniques that are very specific to each of these supplies. So if you have oil pastels, we're going to start by taking a look at the oil pastels, and we'll get to soft pastels in just a moment. So I'm just going to kind of add that here. We're going to talk about scratching, which is also called, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it, graffito. Sgraffito. It's official name, but scratching works just as well. And we're also going to talk about thinning with oils. Right. So these are the two techniques that are very specific to oil pastels. And so to start off, I'm going to take my oil pastel and we're going to talk about scratching first. So I'm just going to cover a space, right? Do a flat painting, right? Fill in so I don't have any of the paper showing through, right? And then I'm going to layer on top of it with some green here. Just layer on top of half of it, right? But kind of fill that in. And remember, when we're talking about techniques, layering is where you're doing a solid color on the bottom and a solid color on top, layering it on top, right? And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm adding that blue surface and then I added some green on half of it. Now, scratching is exactly like it sounds. It's scratching into the surface, right? So what you can use is like a pencil. You can use a toothpick. I have a skewer here. You can use a chopstick, anything to kind of scratch into the surface. And so I'm going to use the end of my skewer, not the point, because it'll be easier to see on camera. But once I have that solid layer, I can take my scratching tool. You can use an awl, an ice pick, the edge of a credit card, anything that will scratch into that surface. And you can see I'm going to make a leaf here, right? And so just kind of scratching in to the surface. So when I'm doing just one color, just that blue, you can see that scratching pulls off that top layer, right? So you see that kind of light blue underneath it, right? And so it's just kind of scratching into that surface. Now, if I want to do it with my green, I layered that green on top of the blue. I'm going to do the same thing, kind of scratch into it with my skewer. And you can see with the green, I scratched off the green, but it's showing blue underneath. So those are a couple different ways to kind of scratch into that surface, right? And you can play around with that too. You can do a page that has so much color on it and then take a black pastel, oil pastel, and put it on the top and carve into that. So you have that black surface background, but you have those beautiful colors coming through. There are a lot of ways to kind of play around with that. And it's a fun technique to work with for sure. It's like reverse coloring maybe, where you're putting that color down first and then drawing into it. Okay. And again, you can use so many different supplies to scratch into that surface. You know, I used a skewer today, but you can use a toothpick. You can use the edge of an old gift card, the corner of a ruler, a palette knife. There's so many different supplies you can use to kind of scratch into that surface. So that's scratching. The next one with the oils is thinning it. Because these oil paints are oil-based, they have a non-drying oil that's used in their makeup. You can use it. you can use it or kind of like you would with oil paints. And so I'm going to take just a little bit of my oil pastel, right? I'm just going to kind of make a mark here, color in that flat painting, right? Flat paint. And then I'm going to use a couple different supplies to kind of paint with it. So I've got a couple paint brushes here. When we were talking about supplies, two of the supplies that we talked about were turpentine and linseed oil. Mineral oil also works. But what this does is it kind of turns that oil pastel mark into a painting. It kind of changes that texture a little bit. I wanted to show how it looks with water too, so you can kind of see the difference. And so I'm going to take my paintbrush really quickly and dip it into some water, just so you can kind of see how it reacts to that, right? So you can kind of move it a little bit, but you don't get a lot of color, a lot of pigment from it. And the truth is, oil and water just don't mix, right? And so there's not a lot of blending that happens. There's a little color that comes from it, but there's not a lot, right? So if you use an oil as your liquid, you're more likely to get a really nice blending. And so I'm going to start off with a little turpentine and show what that looks like. Right? So I'm going to get my brush in that turpentine and just kind of paint it back and forth. Right? And you can see the difference. This was the water. There's not much blending, not much color movement. But when I used that turpentine, it took that oil pastel and kind of blended it and made it look a little more like almost like a watercolor painting, right? Pigment. So it kind of changes the texture. I'm going to use linseed oil, which acts very similar to like mineral oil. And so I'm going to use my paintbrush again, dip it in there, and just kind of spread it, right? You can see the difference here between the different oils. So this was with water, right? You can see that it's not doing much at all. Because it's oil-based, you get better color movement, right? When you're using an oil to paint with it. So this one was that turpentine. You can see it gives it more of that watercolor texture. And then the linseed oil, which is very similar to like a mineral oil in the way it reacts to the oil pastel, right? And you can see the difference in those two oils. But you can see that it really does take that color and can kind of turn that into a different medium almost, right? So again, this was the water, this was the turpentine, and this was the linseed oil. And so these two techniques are very specific to oil pastels. They're not something that work well with the soft pastels, but they're kind of fun, unique to oil pastels and kind of fun to work with. I will say, if you're using the different oils, it is good to be in a well-ventilated space, so you're not inhaling too much of that fragrance. So I'm going to set this one aside and then talk for just a moment about techniques that are specific to soft pastels. And so what we're going to talk about is hatching, cross hatching, and edge. And so the first one is hatching. And this is a drawing term, right? It works really well with soft pastels, but hatching is where you're making these parallel marks. They're all going the same direction. So it's, I'm going to use the different side of my pastel. So I'm using the side of my pastel. This is hatching, making those marks. This is great for shading, for helping give depth, adding color. And it's just this kind of like drawing process, right? Making those parallel lines all going the same direction. Cross hatching is doing that same mark making, those same lines going the same direction, parallel mark, but it's going back through and crossing over them the other direction. So cross hatching is where you're doing this, right? So it's another way to give depth, right? A more concentrated application of pigment, right? Now the edge, using the edge is pretty great. With the soft pastel, there's so many widths that you can use. So I have my pastel, and this is something you don't have to do, but I do, and I kind of I do recommend doing this. When you get your pastel, I just go ahead and break it in half. It makes it easier to use, right? Handle, but it also gives you more corners that are sharp, right? Sharp edges. And so using the edge to draw, I can use like the corner here and create this really fine line. I can use the side here. So this is the length of my pastel. I can use this side on the top, right? And create a wider mark. Or I can use that whole side, that whole length of that pastel to create an even wider mark. This is something that doesn't necessarily work well with oil pastels because the oil pastel sticks are usually round. But the benefit of having that soft pastel is you do have those edges that you can take advantage of, which are really nice. And so it's just like, it's just, I don't, there's a lot of ways to use those edges with your soft pastels. Right? And so those are those different techniques that are very specific to soft pastels. Just to kind of go back over everything we've just talked about, soft pastels, hatching, cross hatching, and using the edge are things that are specific techniques that are specific to soft pastels. They're drawing, the hatching and cross hatching are drawing terms, right? But they work well with these soft pastels. Techniques that are specific to oil pastels are the scratching, where you're filling in a plane of color and then scratching into that surface using an extra tool like a toothpick, skewer, palette knife, things like that. And then thinning with oils, and you can use the different types of oils too. Again, we used water so you could kind of see what it does, but we also use that turpentine and that linseed oil so you can kind of see the difference between those supplies. And then we have some other techniques that work with both pastels, with oil and soft. We have the stippling, which is creating dots, right? Concentrated dots or dots that are spread out, but it helps add shading, right? And depth. Scumbling is another technique that does similarly to stippling. It's that mark making that can be really concentrated or spread out. And so you've got like a concentrated amount of color or shading, right? That's happening there. And then frottage is using the side of that pastel, lightly pressing into the surface to create this very textured background. Then we have where we're adding color, right? And this is something that's with both oil and soft pastels. Gradient is where you're blending, right? You're mixing these colors. You have two different colors, and there's a seamless transition, a natural transition from one color to another. You don't really see where one color ends and the next color begins. It's that smooth transition. Blending is more like where you see where one color ends and the next color begins. But it's going back and forth between painting, using your pastel, and kind of smudging it, whether it's using your finger or a tortilla, a Q-tip, blending stump, but it's kind of mixing those colors together. It's not as smooth as the gradient, right? You see where one color ends and the next one begins. And then overlay is where you're adding a color on top of another color, but you see those colors change, right? It's not that I see blue and where the yellow is, I only see yellow. Where the red is, I only see red. You start to see that green from where the yellow and blue overlap, or that purple where the red and blue overlap. And that's the same with both the oil pastel and the soft pastel. And then the last thing, or I guess the first thing we talked about was layering, where you're doing that solid color on the bottom and you're layering a solid color on top. You're not seeing the color underneath it, right? You're seeing that color that you drew, and that works with both oil pastel and soft pastel. Smudging is where we're kind of smudging the material using our finger or tortilla, a Q-tip. We did a couple different versions, and you can see the way they kind of blend together. That soft pastel blends a little easier than the oil pastel, but they all have different looks, and it's not that one is better or worse than the other. And then that very first technique we talked about was flat painting, where it's covering a solid surface, whether it's a shape, space, lines, it's coloring that in very solidly. So those are the techniques that we kind of use with oil and soft pastels. Honestly, there's really no right or wrong way to use these pastels, right? I do want to encourage experimenting with it. Maybe you want to add a little water to the soft pastel and see how that blends. Maybe you want to mix mediums. I will say I use soft pastels when I'm painting on like masonite or canvas. If I'm painting with acrylic, I can draw on top of it with my soft pastel. I use oil pastels when I do some jelly plate printing because it acts as a wax resist and gives a whole nother texture to my print. So that's one of the great things about pastels is that you can easily use them with other supplies as well. And just as a reminder, these are not the only techniques when it comes to pastels, and it's not important that you know each of these names and techniques. The important thing is knowing that you can play around with these supplies and there are various ways to use them. Thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask or email us at our contact at Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.